more points you would get. Exciting prizes are up for grabs. For more details, visit the information desk. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 9th Jaipur Literature Festival. We wish to welcome our panel of speaker, Meghna Guhathakurta, Sumathy, Sivamohan, Essar, Batool, in conversation with Laxmi Murthy, introduced by Urvashi Butalia and presented by Zubaan, Body of Evidence, Sexual Violence and the Search for Justice in South Asia.
One, can you hear me? Yeah, it's great to see such a lot of people here. When I was walking in and I saw the queue snaking up to Darbar Hall, I was worried. I thought, my God, everybody thinks we're going to talk about sex, but we're not. We're going to talk about sexual violence. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this session, which is presented not only by Zubaan. We get the billing there, but it's slightly incomplete. It's presented by Zubaan and the International Development Research Center, IDRC Canada. It's a session based on a 3-year research project that is coordinated by Zubaan and that spreads over 5 countries in South Asia: Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India, and that looks at histories of sexual violence and the search for justice by victims and survivors of sexual violence, that explores the deep silence that surrounds this subject. All of us know it exists, but it is ignored in many official documents, in discussions, and despite the fact that internationally sexual violence has become very important on the agenda of discussions on human rights and torture, in South Asia, we do not see much of that. And in this research project, we commissioned about 50 papers on the subject, and all those papers have come together and reveal a whole range of very interesting things, which our panel this afternoon will talk to you about. And before I hand over to the panel, I would just like to say to you that we think that this subject is something that maybe in the 21st century does not take as terrible forms as it does. Violence against women, insult to women. But this morning, and this is not an instance of sexual violence, but it is nonetheless violence and disrespect. When 2 of my colleagues were sitting in a session in the Charbagh, there was a large, rude man who came and pushed himself into the seat between them, which was there for a 3rd colleague who had gone to visit the toilet. And he shouted at them and called them all kinds of names and was extremely racist in the way he addressed them. And when one of them said to him, "You are so racist, why are you being so racist?" he said something like, "Where did she go to school?" and some other terrible comment. So it's not as if this kind of misogyny and this kind of hatred hasn't gone away. And it takes the form of sexual violence in many places. And terrible sexual violence, and then women are left to live with those consequences. So that is what we'll be discussing in this panel, presented by Zubaan and IDRC. And I'll hand you over now to Laxmi Murthy, who's going to moderate the panel for us.
Hello, everyone. And as people are still settling in, we'll just start off with what's a very exciting moment for the project. The project, the outcome of about 50 research papers, as Urvashi mentioned, is about 8 volumes on sexual violence and impunity in South Asia. And we're really happy that the first one is ready to be released here. And I'd like to invite Seba Hussain and one of the co-authors, Natasha, who's in the audience, to please come up to release it. We have with us the other co-author, Essar Batool. These are two young women from Kashmir. Come, Natasha. Just hold it up. Just hold it up. Yeah, hold it simply. The name of this book is Do You Remember Kunan Poshpora? We'll hear more about it during the session, but this is just to launch this very exciting book. There are copies available, and there are two young authors you can get to sign them after the session. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you. Oops. Seba, you want to say a few words about the book? Want to say something about the book? Okay. So I'd like to introduce the other panelists. This is Essar Batool, as I just said. She's a young activist, writer from Kashmir. Meghna Guhathakurta is a well-known researcher. Many of you would know her, an academic, also an activist. Sumathy Sivamohan from Sri Lanka, writer, activist, academic, playwright. And we're just going to launch straight off into the topic. And it's really interesting that we have a pretty good representation from South Asia, because what we've noticed during the research is the common threads. As much different as the societies around South Asia are, there's a very common thread binding it. And the one we chose to explore was sexual violence, mostly on women, and the impunity and silence that surrounds it. So straight away to Meghna. Meghna, what motivated you to research on sexual violence, and how do you locate that in the moment of the birth of Bangladesh, the nation building of Bangladesh? Could you tell us a little about it?
Thank you, Laxmi. It's a pleasure to be here and in front of such an audience to tell a little bit about myself, in fact, because myself is what is located within my writings. I have had experiences of violence like any girl in South Asia does. They witness violence, they experience it in different forms, as Urvashi was just saying. But I think for me, when I was in my final years at school, the liberation war of Bangladesh took place. And it took place right in my very household, because it was the 25th of March, the dark night, where the Pakistan army cracked down on the innocent people in Dhaka and other regions of Bangladesh. I was a schoolgirl. My father was a teacher at the university. He taught English literature. And hordes of Pakistan army came in and asked for the professor. And they asked in Urdu, Professor Saab kahan hai? And they, my mother was with me, and we are three in the family. And my mother said that, why do you want him? And said, we want him, we want to take him. My father asked why. They didn't answer, they took him out. And simultaneously, we were living in the campus at Dhaka University, and there were other professors in other flats. They brought down the head of the Department of Statistics, Professor Zubaan, and his whole family. They took away the boys who were more than 16 years of age, and they basically shot them. My father, we later found out, was shot in front of our house. He was asked his name, he gave his name. He was asked his religion, he gave his religion, and then there was an order to shoot him. He didn't die instantaneously. He was conscious. One of the bullets paralyzed him downwards, and then we couldn't take him to the hospital because there was a curfew, and there was firing all around. So we kept him in the house. In that house, all of the night of 25th, all the day and the night of 26th, and only in the 27th morning could we take him to the hospital, where he succumbed to his injuries on the 30th of March. So this was a violence that was, that shaped my life and my writing. But it wasn't there. My mother decided not to go away to India, although our families were there. She said she had to prove my father's death because when he died, it was the written bullet by injury by bullet, but later the doctor gave, when my mother went for a death certificate because she needed the money from his provident funds, they gave him death by pneumonia. So she said, if we leave this country, we'll never be able to prove his death, so we have to stay there. My mother and I lived at different places, at families and friends, all through the 9 months of the war. And sometimes we had to take other identities because we couldn't give our own identity. I stayed as a Christian orphanage under the name of Monica Rosario. My mother stayed in a hospital, although she was all right, but she was kept in a hospital. It was with the help of my school, which was a Christian school, Holy Cross Convent. The sisters there hid us, and we stayed with the goodwill of many friends, and it was only after liberation that we could talk about it. But I think of course, and my mother later on dedicated her life for the women who were raped during the war because she was a member of the first rehabilitation center sent up by the government to rehabilitate women who were raped. And so she served there for more than 5 years. And through her, we heard tales that were not told at that time, but later on. So it was basically this violence and the breaking, but more than the violence, it was the breaking of silence. Because even the silence we came across, because all these 9 months of the war, we couldn't talk. My mother couldn't even cry. So we couldn't mourn also. It was only after the liberation we could do that, but even then, the writing was away from it was events, it was happening, newspaper people came in, took stories, but we didn't write. I remember, this is where South Asian kind of bonding comes in, I remember when I was at the university, and I belonged to a women's group, and it was from a Sri Lankan women's group who asked us that could we write about militarization and women. And it was all suddenly, my friend said, you do it. I didn't know what came out, but I said, I can't do it. I can't write it, but I wrote a poem, and it was in Bangla, but the poem was in the form of a letter to a friend whom I knew was Sri Lankan in the name, but it was also a Bengali name. So that's how I first expressed my feelings and my writing of the violence, sexual violence, and also violence in general, and how it affected women. And from then on, I think the 1990 NGO Beijing Forum, which declared rape as a war of instrument, we were taken there by Sri Lankan friends, by Indian friends, and I gave testimony there on the war. And what opened my eyes was the kind of research, the legal research that was done at that time by women, by feminists, to bring the question of sexual violence during conflict period out into the open and challenge the existing laws. So that really opened up my mind. After a while, I relate to militarization. I relate to militarization everywhere. I related it into my own current country as well, where in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, there were abductions and killings and sexual violence still rampant.
You've raised a very important, I think, core point about women bearing witness, women breaking the silence, and in some way chipping away at impunity. I'd like to move now to Sri Lanka and ask Sumathy, in what ways was researching and writing about sexual violence helpful in breaking the silence around it, especially given the protracted, long ethnic conflict and war in Sri Lanka?
For me, wanting to talk about sexual violence, I had been talking of sexual violence in the war, but not in relation to the last phase of the war, which was in 2008 and 2009, when in May 2009, the war came to an end. But I had been writing about it in theater and film and in my own academic writings differently. But the need for writing about sexual violence opened up a way for me to look at women's voices that had been suppressed by those, and I'm saying this in a very decidedly. There had been a big hue and cry over war crimes in Sri Lanka and rape by the Sri Lankan army. And what we found was that both the Sri Lankan state and some of the lobbies that took up the war crime, helped in a way suppressing women's voices. They kind of aided and abetted in a very contradictory fashion. And for me, going and talking to large numbers of women about violence demonstrated that sexual violence is about so many other things as well. It's about the economy, about dispossession, about marginalization. Because if you look at who had suffered most as women in the last war, it was the women who had not been able to leave the war, who did not have access to powerful agencies, who could not bribe. So the people who suffered and who had to face the worst brunt of the war and who suffered. But the leveling of it as just sexual violence somehow reduced, I think, raised the voices. The women were not able to speak about sexual violence as something that happened to them in a particular kind of context. I'll give you an example, and then that might make it kind of easier. Talking to women about the last war, they said they were fleeing, they were escaping, they were coming in from one territory to another, territory that was controlled by the LTT, which was on its way out, kind of defeated, and into the Sri Lankan state area. And they many of them had the experience of walking through a narrow strip of land, a pathway of about, say, 50 meters, stark naked. There was some kind of a barrier fence through which they were covered, but their feet and their heads could be seen. And on one end, they had to take off their clothes and give it to a soldier, female soldier. And as they came out at the other end, they would receive their clothes again. And then they told us, forgetting our shame, we walked to our survivor. And for me, that kind of, this really double textured walk, and they also said, well, it was covered, but who knows, they could have been watching. And for me, that very textured walk through, against which, I mean, the gaze, the supposed gaze of the state, gaze of the soldiers, the female soldier who was taking the clothes and returning it to them. And they are telling me, forgetting our shame, we walked, was a statement of great will, the will to survive. And for me, sexual violence is somehow couched in that contradictory moment of wanting to tell a story, but you can tell the story only in terms of a suppression, a subordination. And for me, it's then Now we travel abroad and through the US airports, then you go through those, I don't know what you call them. Is it X-ray? Yeah, and then you know, everything, you are stripped down to your bare bones. And then, you know, so here there is this kind of a very intimate kind of violence, and you forget your shame, and there is this total anonymity of whose body, whose gaze, and you know, so incredibly technologized. And I thought sexual violence, globalization, war, women's bodies, how differently we are placed in this world, but also how commonly. So these are the insights that I gathered, but for me it is a way to talk. Sexual violence, talking to the women, was about trying to find that the moment of politics in which women's agency is located, and not to talk of victims.
We'll move on to Kashmir now and Essar. You know, taking off from there, like what is the moment in which Kunan Poshpora, the mass rape of, you know, almost 100 women happened almost 25 years ago, in fact to the date 25 years ago. So what is it that has remained alive in the memory? What made you pick it up? And even the name of the book, Do You Remember Kunan Poshpora? Could you tell us what motivated so many young people to remember it, and how does it connect with your present?
Basically, we come from Kashmir, where you live a militarized occupation every day. So where the struggle for, the renewed struggle for Kunan Poshpora started was the point where in December 2012 in India there was this brutal rape case, and that evoked a very strong reaction from the Indian civil society as a whole. It was then that we were working as volunteers with the JK, Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Societies, and you know, we were surprised because anywhere in the world a rape has to be condemned, because it is the worst form of violence that, you know, you can perpetrate against a woman to break her or the community, whichever way it is intended. So we just thought about our own history, which is full of such violations on such a large scale. And one of the co-authors, Samrina, she called me up and, you know, she just told me, she asked me this question: do you remember Kunan Poshpora? And you just see the significance of this question is that we need to ask ourselves that do we remember that you know, mass rape that happened on 23rd February 1991. So why do we need to ask each other, do we remember it? Because we live in a place where every other day is an anniversary of a massacre or a rape again. So we came together, some of the friends came together, and we thought that it was high time that we, the younger generation, took up this case. It was not that we opened it, the case was already being fought by the survivors of Kunan Poshpora. We merely just added to the effort. So because we live in that same zone, nothing has changed except for the fact that voices have started coming up. Because even till date, it remains one of the most militarized zones in the world. So we are not free from that sexual violence. The threat of sexual violence actually looms large on, you know, over our heads, and we experience it in the most subtle forms every day, whether it's walking, you know, passing by a bunker, or, you know, we are confined to our homes because of the presence there. So basically we saw that it connected with us, and we saw that the resistance put up by the women was very, 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 you know, respect worthy, and that we needed to push it forward. So where they had left it with the State Human Rights Commission, we took it up, we filed a petition once more. And because we wanted just women to be a part of this movement, to make it a women's movement, we mobilized many more women. Interestingly, we had around over 100 women signing up for the petition to have the case reopened in the High Court. But then the High Court said that we needed to submit some of our identity proofs, such as passports or, you know, some other valid proofs. So there was this, the first step of covering up, covering it up again, the first step of backing it down. So many of the petitioners just withdrew because out of the fear that the state has created. So they did not want their passports to be taken away, or they did not want restrictions to be imposed on them. They feared for their careers, and we were left with 50 women who basically filed the petition later on, which was dismissed by the High Court initially, but then admitted finally after a long legal struggle. So when you ask me the question that why did we decide to reopen the case after 22 years back then in 2014, I think my co-author again, Samrina, she puts it in a very beautiful way when she says, and I quote, we filed the petition not because we expect justice from the system, but because we wanted to make the Indian Army answerable, to make them understand that they cannot go scot-free and repeat the same crime. Our struggle is not about outcomes, but developing a culture of resistance where people will question impunity and where we will not remain silent in the face of injustice. The fear that it can happen with us is much more than the fear that our careers will be ruined. To live a life with dignity and honor is more important than anything else. So, thank you. So I think this pretty much sums it up, our struggle, because many of the people have asked us, why have you reopened the case? Do you expect justice from the Indian judicial system? So to that question, we wanted this case to be reopened so that it comes alive in public memory, so that it doesn't die a death of oblivion, because that is what the perpetrators want. They want you to forget it. We also reopened the case because, we do not want them to think that yes, we can get away with anything we do. So there was this strong need of young women coming up and speaking for themselves as a collective. And that is exactly what motivated us to reopen this case again.
And you also mentioned that there were a lot of threats to your own security and so on, which I think points to the, intimidation and the whole atmosphere of fear. So could you talk a little about how you overcame that?
Of course. I mean, I think when I first told my parents that I was going to be part of a petition that was challenging the Indian Armed Forces and the Indian state, I think the fear on their faces was enough to let me know that, this was something huge I was going to undertake. And many of us knew that we'd be under surveillance. Many of us knew we will be on the radar of certain agencies now. And again, being a woman, there's this fear of, rape being used against us. I mean, I think we have talked, the authors have been in conversation like, ab kya karenge? What if we are, abducted someday and we are raped? What do we do then? But then we realized that, that if we kept thinking about that fear, maybe we were just as equally responsible for the crime as the perpetrators. So somewhere we had to take a stand, somewhere we had to take a step and come forward and speak for ourselves. Because yes, it is absolutely true, there's a huge fear of being, I don't know, being a target for the state, because you're speaking out against it. It's a powerful agency. I mean, it can do anything. You're just common people. One day you're just, working around, and the other day you're standing up against it. In fact, we faced quite, I don't know, I think they were funny, but they were very significant also in the sense, some incidents when we were going for the court hearings in Kupwara. Kupwara is some 200 kilometers away from Srinagar, because the shift was focused from Srinagar to Kupwara by the Indian Armed Forces, so that because the case was getting huge media coverage. They did not want that to happen, so they just shifted the case to Kupwara. And once we were there, because the Indian Army officials used to come, so whenever they used to come, there was still that that atmosphere of intimidation. They would come and they would just size us up, look at us like this. When we left, their council, the army council, would come up to us and ask us, "You girls, what are you doing with this? Are you from a human rights organization?" Things like that male gaze, using that male gaze to again suppress us and tell us, we are watching you. So that fear has always been there, but we realized that, fear is exactly what the perpetrator wants. And fear is exactly the perpetrator's strength. So we're not going to give that to them, actually.
All power to you. Talking about justice, I mean, you said it seems like what you're saying is that justice is more of a process. It's not that you're going to get justice at the end of it, but you want to show that accountability is, something you press for. So, Meghna, I'd like to ask you, in terms of the whole Bangladesh legal system, and also now the tribunals that have been set up to look at war crimes, what is the hope for justice for women in any of these structures, and how do you see talking and breaking the silence leading somewhere to justice?
Well, actually, the demand for justice for war criminals was brought to the fore by a woman in Bangladesh. After the Simla agreement, where India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh was not a party, they decided to take the prisoners of war back to Pakistan. There was at times the Pakistan government did kind of agree that they will be trying them themselves. But what was left in Bangladesh were the collaborators. And the justice for at least those who remained in Bangladesh was brought about by Shahid Jahanare Imam, who is the mother of a martyred freedom fighter's son. So she brought the whole demand for justice out in the 1990s. But even then, it took a lot of ups and downs in the government. They were, at the time that she brought the demand and she held the People's Tribunal, everyone that was there who signed the tribunal, it was symbolic tribunal, it wasn't really a tribunal, but because they were held for treason. And even I was part of a witness, and I had to hide for one night at least in a country that my father helped to free. In that free country, I had to hide for one night. My mother, similarly, the fear that your mother showed, said, a reporter said, hide, they're going to come after you. So it was a big, and after that, it took 40 years, a new generation, interestingly enough. We know that generation after generation, they're supposed to forget the past. But that's where I really saw that if justice is not served, you cannot forget the past. There is no way you can forget the past. So it was only after that this tribunal was set up. Yes, there are a lot of problems in the tribunal. Interestingly enough, because there was investigation, there was an investigation department and there was a prosecution department. The investigation department did bring in the the rape of women as a war crime. And they actually came to me because my mother was a member of that organization, and they wanted some evidence from it. There was very little evidence you can give, 40 years. My mother died in 1993, so she was not alive to give testimony, but I did have some photographs which I gave. So I knew that it was being considered, but when the prosecution came in, they decided not to take it as a mainstream thing. They said it will be implicated, but it is not sort of, it's not canceled altogether. It will, so yes, there is this still want, but perhaps because of our continuous demands of the women's movement, what they did do was address the women's role in the war, especially the war widows. Our fathers died, many people's mothers died, but the remaining parent actually brought up this new generation. So that was really something that was given in a verdict by the judge. So that was good. And lately, another verdict came in where about because that women were shamed into silence and their own society and their own household sometimes shamed them into silence. It was not brought out. So in order to break the silence, someone in the government, or the government at that time, named them as war heroines or birangonas. But many people, we critique that it wasn't enough, they should be called freedom fighters. So they were, in a judgment itself, the verdict, the judge gave 40 women, 40 such women, the term that they are freedom fighters just as much as the men that fought the war. So that was a kind of a recipient, but a very interesting perspective from a woman who wasn't among the 40s, but was actually, what she underwent was sexual slavery per se during the whole time of the war. And she's a renowned artist who came forward, Firdausi Priyabhashini. And that made me rethink about this whole thing that we say, Viranganas, is it a sex system? Is it enough? Is it labeling? But what her life is that no one can take away my survival. No one can take away my struggle. My struggle is what I am standing on. And that is my identity. So no one can take, I don't mind. I'm very happy for those 40 women who got this nomenclature. And I may or may not, but no one can take away from me what I gained. So, and that is what I am now. And so she feels quite content with herself, that she doesn't mind what the state gives, but she's not living for the state. She's living for herself.
Yes, absolutely. Sumathy, what I'd like you to do is reflect a little bit on the role of art, theatre, literature in talking about these, and I think you'd like to read a little excerpt of a poem as well. And what are the roles actually these forms play in justice seeking, or do we look at it as something totally separate?
Our war of 30 years has left a community of victims behind and no perpetrators. When I say no perpetrators, I think Sri Lanka as a nation has, as a country, has suffered hugely and continues to suffer. So a victim is also perpetrator in say a person who belongs to the Tamil community and has lost her child to the war, taken away by the army or whatever it is, could have also been a perpetrator by maybe spying for just a hypothetical case, for the LTT, or those who were in the LTT were torturing. So, but have also undergone, torture and rape, tremendous violation of their bodies at the hands of the state. So there has to be a certain kind of rethinking of justice in terms of moving away from the individual kind of culpability that we are used to kind of, tagging justice to. There had been very few cases that had kind of been that had come to the courts and also been, and redressed in terms of rape. I can think of only one, after the war ended, and that also happened after the war. So the women could identify and say, these are the soldiers, these are the men. During the war, whatever happened is shrouded in mystery, because how do you recognize? And that's how our legal system is constructed, right? So for me, then we have to rethink the idea of justice and take it away from the purely legalistic. And that's where I've come up with the idea of survival, and that is to tell the story. But it's not just about telling somebody's story and healing. It's about rethinking the idea of yourself and who you are as being part of the nation, even rethinking the idea of being a Tamil, because being a Tamil at the moment or during the war and the war crimes cry and all that has turned the Tamil into a kind of a victim status, and people have kind of been thinking of that as the way to launch your battle cry, but that has not been very productive. So how as a woman to rethink of it all as kind of as a woman who has agency to reconceptualize the, I will stop talking and I'll read from, so I've been working on women's stories, and 2 dramatizations I have loosely based on real stories. I'll just read a little from 2 different ones. This from a long time ago, I hope. This from a performance. It will always be like yesterday. This I might carry it. All that happened to me, exposing my womanhood to the whole world. My shame, my shame. My mother could talk only of Kannahi and Arundhati. No one told me what became of mortal women of flesh and blood. Even in buses, how nauseating it is to be plastered tight together with beefy, sweaty men. Just imagine. I had no inner strength to keep off the prying hands of those dogs. I'm weak, a weak and fallen woman. Some other time I would have kept it hugging to myself. I would not breathe a word even to my husband. He's all sympathetic and loving now, but who knows? Deep inside, he might be smoldering every time he comes near. I'm alone in this. Everyone else is untouched, and I have been raped. Yes, rape is the word. You can talk for all your worth. Is that going to give me rise? And the stench of their sweaty breath overcoming me. 1, 2, thrice it happened. They come through the back door. There. What is my strength against this SMG, AK-47 and all? All the gods desert me at this terrifying hour, and I accept their verdict. A demon floods washing over me, and I'm going under. My husband, children, please forgive me. Thank you.
Before we throw it open to the House, Essar, I'd just like you to reflect a little bit again on what you just touched upon. This 25-year-old silence, distortion, bias, prejudice that the women of these villages have faced, which is really, not just an individual experience or even of that village, it's the experience of largely large parts of Kashmir. So how has that actually permeated the consciousness of women of your generation growing up with that kind of, societal memory?
We come from a generation basically where we were, because when the incident of Kunun Poshpura happened, I think we were just 2 or 3 years old, and some of us weren't even born. So as a younger generation, we come up with a story, we come up in a very conflicting situation basically, where our families try to protect us from such memories because they fear for us, And on the other side, there are these open memories, waiting in search for you to come and discover them. So basically when we grow up, sometimes in comfort and sometimes it's very gradual that the realization dawns on you that you live in a place where the atmosphere is actually filled with cries of women and men both. Because when we talk about sexual violence in Kashmir, it's not only constrained to women. It has been widely used against men as well during tortures, which have gone underreported or unreported because of the associated stigma with sexual violence against men. Sodomy and, putting in articles into the genitals or into the, into the organs of men has been widely reported, but it has not been able to gather that attention because the men know that it carries that stigma and that, that fear of, not being accepted in a society again is always there. When we talk about the, the cover-ups and the distortions, I think these started back in this particular case. Basically, these started right from the, occurrence of that incident. When the villagers the very next day, they wrote a letter to the DC Kupwara, but the Indian Armed Forces placed a cordon in the village for days to come so that they couldn't go to have medical examination done. They couldn't go and, file an FIR. So that distortion started from there, whereby it was taken up by different actors, such as in cases like Wajahat Habibullah, published a report. He was the divisional commissioner, and he published a report where it's very clear. When you read the book, there are excerpts from the report, and it's very clear it's biased towards, the survivors. And then there was this brilliant investigation done by the now late V.G. Varghese, which actually humiliated the women of Kunun Poshpara so much by saying that these are unmarried girls and their hymens are not intact. So how do you know they weren't having premarital sex? How do you know they were raped? I mean, this is the kind of tools you use to belittle women who are telling you that we've been raped by the armed forces. What they he mentioned in his report, Crisis in Credibility, that they are doing this, the women are actually lying on the behest of militants. So, they have been they're scared by the militants and they're just doing this to defame the army. And the same argument was used in a court hearing by the Council for the Indian Armed Forces, who said that we are malified and suspicious agents and we need to be taken note of. We are trying to defame the otherwise glorious and infallible Indian army. That has been their routine since then. Every attempt at justice was met with this kind of resistance by the Indian state. There were otherwise, because we think the survivors of Kunun Poshpara mass rape and torture, because that night even the men were taken and they were tortured all night. They have been, countered by the Indian state at every stage. So basically, it's a long history of distortions and cover-ups and lies, but that is where this documentation comes in. There's this interesting line I read somewhere that the oppressor always asks the oppressed people, what is your evidence that you're suffering from oppression? They are suffering from oppression. You can't believe them. You're asking them for evidence. So we are just creating evidences, for the oppressor to have a look at, so that they can see what, that there are, because there are, in this case, there are huge proofs that the Indian state has chosen to ignore time and again in the previous struggle by the survivors and in this struggle today. So basically, that is what we need to challenge right now, and that is why we've reconnected with the case and, to put away with these distortions now.
Yeah, I think this is, it's a very important addition, this body of evidence, and I think it's just a very slow but steady process, and all of you have been part of this process towards justice and breaking the silence. We'll take questions now and comments. Yeah, this gentleman in the row here.
Hello, check. Yeah. Hi, ma'am. I'm Vivek. Ma'am, like a common thread that I see first in Bangladesh, then in Kashmir, and then recently in Sri Lanka, is this idea that, like, this nationalism that converts into jingoism becomes more supreme than an idea of respecting the body. and then converts itself into sexual violence if the need arises, right? So then we kind of believe that if it is for the greater good, which in this case is the country, then ideas like attacking the body in any and using violence as a method for this end is legit. So do you think that there is like a need to revisit such notions where we need to kind of decide and and ask ourselves what precedes and what succeeds and what is more supreme, and like what priorities do we need to have as a country or as people?
Are you addressing this to any specific
any
person or anyone? Would
because
you
that's
like
a
to
common
take
thread
it?
I found in all the three countries.
Okay,
Thank you.
Meghna, I'd like to.
Yeah, there is one way
I would
in which
also
you can interpret from nationalism to ultranationalism, Zingoism in the body. That's one way. But I think being a teacher of international relations for 22 years, I read a very interesting book called Have You Read Any Military Manuals Recently? And that will be basically about, will tell you everything about what's happening in Sri Lanka, Kashmir, and Bangladesh, and Chittagong Hill Tracts, and any other country. Because, and that's one of the revealing truths that I found out during the Beijing conference, was that when women wanted rape was not considered to be the highly punishable crime. So they had to prove rape as a torture. And torture was the highest punishable crime under the Geneva Convention at that time. So when they had to do that, they actually focused on torture. And before, torture was to elicit information from the victim. But now, torture is a way to disseminate civil society, because in a country, even in a part of a country where the men go to war, either for their national identity or for other reasons, they go out and the women are remaining in the villages, in the households. They have to look after elders. They have to look after children. They form the last vestiges of civil society. And rape is an instrument in which you can hit the last vestiges of civil society, the last vestiges of resistance. And that is where you can read what is happening in all these countries and all these spaces. So where do our military manuals come from is something that we have to revisit. In Bosnia, in Serbia and Bosnia, women were found to be raped twice. The same woman who was raped during World War II was raped again in the Bosnian crisis. And interestingly, the men who raped her was uttering the same slanderous words, the same, sort of calling her the same names that they called during the World War II. So that tells you a lot about where we have to look. And the perception of masculinity and every other thing, that will take a long discussion, but let me just,
okay. Lady there with the reddish thing.
So all of you come from very difficult histories, and I have the utmost respect for that. But my question is, where do men fit into this fight? That, okay, we have a panel full of women, which is fine. It's kind of maybe nice to see even, because you have so many panels full of men at the festival. But particularly for an issue like this, I mean, considering the fact that you said you had 100 signatures which you presented to the court and they dismissed it, and then it reduced to 50, but you had 100 women's signatures. How much more powerful would it have been if there were men who were asking for answers for the actions of other men? For example, if there's a 2611 and there's a huge hue and cry in India and we want justice, but what if the citizens of Pakistan were to demand answers from their own government? How much more powerful is that? Why is it that we feel the need that women empowerment only counts? Why is it like it only counts if women fight for it?
She wants to.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very valid question. Basically, first of all, I'd like to answer the first concern of your question, which was if men, in place of 100 women, if 100 men had signed the petition, would it have been taken in very easily? I say no, it would not have. Because we've used a line in the book, I think in my chapter somewhere, resistance has no gender. And just like that, oppression does not have any gender. So it has nothing to do with the gender actually. It has more to do with the cover-ups, with the obstruction to justice, to the whatever the meaning of justice in this case is. So it has nothing to do with gender, and definitely we were not trying to make it a women's empowerment thing per se, because what we wanted was that women have been portrayed, and in this case by Indian media, as burqa-clad, timid women sitting in their homes crying. It's not true. Please come to Kashmir and you'll see the women in Kashmir are active participants of resistance against militarization. You'll see them protesting, you'll see them throwing stones, you'll see them expressing their dissent and their protest, registering their protest in any way, okay? So to dispel that and to bring forth a collective of women, of the younger generation, because the 100 women that we had gathered were of varying ages. So what we wanted to do was to create a women's narrative in a society, because we cannot obviously say that Kashmir is not a patriarchal society. It is a patriarchal society like any other society, maybe not that rigid, but it is. So what we wanted to do was for women to come up and rise together. So that is the whole, I think that should answer your question basically.
Yeah, so
I want to say something very quickly for that. I don't think it's about women's empowerment at all. It is a strategic use, I think, in Sri Lanka, but I think it's applicable to other situations also. A very strategic use of women's paradoxical strength because of because of the concentration of the gaze on the woman's body and women as collectivities. Women have also acquired a certain kind of collective power. So as mothers, as one could go and ask for the bodies that fortunately, I don't know, unfortunately not allowed to women. Mother has the right to mourn and ask, which they had mobilized, deployed strategically. So it's not about, artificially constructing a women's empowerment thing. Yeah.
Okay. How does one choose actually? Only one last? I thought we have another 5 minutes. No?
Only one.
Okay, right here in front. Would you like to?
Hello. So first of all, I would like to thank for such candid presentation, right, and sincere approach to the topic. I represent Jaipur Women Bloc here, and I absolutely agree that it is shame that pushes women every time into silence. However, shame is a taught and learned behavioral feature, right? So what we should change, the way we bring our girls, so that probably they could overcome the shame. Mm-hmm.
Sumathy, you want to go about shame?
Okay, I'll answer that. I'll try. Well, yeah, it's something that needs a lot of in-depth discussion. Your question actually points towards where we make a transition from the discussion of violence to the discussion of peace. And what is this transformation that needs to take place? So yes, it is shame about the body, it is shame about a lot of things that the women should or should not do. It has to do with the broader structures of patriarchy and patriarchal values, which are embedded in every society that we know of. When women, I remember, if I can just, it's also about breaking silences. When do women break silences? I remember if you're told stories of Cinderella and the Prince Charming, and you wait and wait until you see that person, and also even in a difficult relationship in domestic violence, when you wait for the change to take place and it doesn't happen, It's the silence. Once you start breaking the silence is your answer. Similarly, I think when it is about, when you say that about shame about the body, I mean, the whole thing about women's body is a cultural notion. And in many cultures, women's bodies are treated. Maybe we should look at places and spaces where women's body is not treated in a shameful way. So have we researched on those spaces? How much of us have researched on those spaces? This is when the question that you ask actually takes our direction away, our gaze away from violence to what can be made peace and what can be peaceful spaces where women can be confident, they can feel empowered, and like many women that you see here, my colleagues here, that they have survived. And maybe we should look at processes of survival.
And I'd just like to add to that, I think shame is dealt with also when the consequences of coming out or speaking out are, held together by a supportive atmosphere, whether it's a women's movement or a more supportive society, some kind of campaigning around these issues so that coming out is not a lonely process or breaking the silence is not a lonely process. And that's very much to do with social mobilization. And I think it's happening. There are now several women who've been raped who say, we have no shame. It's the guys who did it and they're going to speak out. So it is happening and it's going to take time, but it's happening. Yeah, so we'll end here and thank you all.
We wish to thank our speakers, Meghna Guhathakurta, Sumathy, Sivamohan, Essar, Batool, Laxmi Murthy, and Urvashi Butalia. The session was presented by Zubaan. Thank you all very much. Coming up next at 5:15, the other Americas and Europe, literature beyond passports and magical realism. Essar, Batool and Laxmi Murthy will be signing their books. So if you have a copy, please line up outside the venue at the book signing area. They'll be coming there very shortly. And if you don't have one, grab a copy from the festival bookshop.